What are some ways that we can, or what are some things that we can do, principles that we can practice that will help us to communicate so that others will listen? And here's the first one. Start with the facts. Start with the facts. Start with things that we absolutely do know. Now, don't start with our interpretation of the facts. Just start with the facts. And we kind of see that in this passage. In Luke chapter 10, verse 40, looking at that again, it says, "But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, 'Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work?'" That's the fact. Mary was sitting there, Martha agreed with it, and Mary agrees with it. "I was sitting here while you were doing all the work." And then she says, "Tell her to come and help me." Which I love what Martha does, because Martha does what many of us do. So you think Mary and Martha have had this conflict before? You think it's been an issue, a problem in their relationship? You think it's been a challenge? Do you think Mary rolled her eyes when she heard Martha say that? And I love what Martha does. Martha doesn't go, "Hey, Mary, it's unfair that you just sit there at the feet of Jesus while..." No, you know what she does? She goes to Jesus and says to Jesus, because that's what we want, right? That's what we want. We go to someone and we complain and we want endorsement. We want them to go, "Yeah, that is so unfair. That's so unfair." And so she thought what Jesus would do is go, "You know what, Martha, Mary, get up, go over there." She thought, Jesus would endorse what she was feeling. But the good thing is, we know the fact. The issue is that Mary was just sitting there. And so I think a lot of times what we have a tendency to do is when we want to handle conflict, we don't start with the facts, we start with our interpretation of the facts. And we call that narrative. We start with our narrative. And the problem is with our narrative is that we can go back and forth with our narratives. We can go back and forth with that. Because here's the thing is our narrative is our opinion of what it is. Our narrative is our opinion of what has happened. That's what our narrative is. And so as we go back and forth with that, sometimes what we can do is we lose sight of the facts because we are so focused on our narrative. And that's what really causes fights. That's what really causes disagreements, is our interpretation of the facts. So that's why I encourage you, start with the facts, because that's something that we can agree on. We can look at that. And then what we can do is once we get all the facts out of the way, because here's what we might find out, is once we share the facts, we might realize oh, my interpretation was not based on everything because I didn't know all the facts. So then once I find out all the facts, I can say, oh, you know what, I need to change my narrative because my interpretation of the facts is not incorrect, just because I didn't have the full picture. So I think it's good for us to practice that and do that. So here are some examples that I can give you. For example, a fact that you can start with. You were late to work again. That's a fact. You both agree with that we're late. Here's a narrative that we do sometimes. You must not want this job. That's the narrative that we start with. How about this one? There's a strange charge on our credit card. That's a fact. Sometimes we start with the narrative is, you having an affair, right? We start with the narrative. Or how about this one? You didn't show up for our appointment. That's a fact. The narrative can be, well, you jerk, you have no respect for my time. That's the narrative. So you can tell, depending upon which one we start with, you can see whether this can be a conversation or this could be an argument. So that's why we want to start with the facts. We want to start with the facts. So then the next step is, once we are able to get the facts out of the way and begin to talk about those, then the next step would be to tell your narrative. Tell your narrative. Because that is important. Because what happens is if we just talk about the facts, but we never get to a point where we talk about our narrative, then there may be feelings that we have that we never deal with. That we never deal with, that we never walk through together. So it's important that we do that as well. So you want to tell your narrative. For example, in going back to Luke chapter 10, verse 40, it says, "But Martha was distracted by the big dinner that she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, 'Lord, doesn't it seem unfair?'" That's Martha's narrative. It's unfair. "To you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work. Tell her to come and help me." So it is important that you do also talk about your narrative. It is important that you do talk about your conclusion based upon the facts, because once you see all the facts, your narrative may be true or may be accurate, and it may be something that they do need to deal with. For example, these receipts have come in, and I've noticed that there is a difference. Like, why don't you come sit down and why don't you look at these receipts with me? And as we look at these receipts, can you see how there's a charge that's here, but there's no receipt for that charge? We can kind of walk through that together and just saw the facts. And so now I tell my narrative. It feels like, based upon this inaccuracy here, it feels like our store is being stolen from. So can you explain to me why there's this inaccuracy in the receipts? So you kind of see where that so now we're dealing with the receipts, and now we're not dealing with me calling that person a thief, we're just dealing with inaccuracies. But it is important that we talk about our narrative and we kind of begin to communicate that as well. Now, there's a passage in Scripture that I think is really great at helping us to learn how to communicate our narrative. And it's a passage that we see at weddings. It's a passage that maybe we see one another. It's one of those passages that we go, oh, that's a great passage. Because it's one of those passages that we see that makes us feel good. And it's a passage that describes love. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, it actually gives us an idea also that we could apply on how to be able to communicate our narrative. It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning at verse 4, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrong or being wrong. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. So now what if we took this and applied this to communicating our narrative? Communicating our narrative is patient, because love is patient. Why is that patience necessary? Because here's the truth, is I may look the facts and I may have my narrative that is here, but they may have a different narrative. And so if we're patient with one another, we have a chance to be able to work through that narrative together. Love is kind. So I communicate my narrative in a way that is kind, that is thoughtful. It's kind. I love that. It's not boastful. It's not jealous. It's not rude. Now, if we look at boastful and jealous, is my narrative fueled by an inefficiency in me? Am I jealous? Or am I proudful? Am I prideful? Am I prideful? English 101 there. But am I prideful? I can begin to look at that and look at how it's not rude. Communicating your marriage, it's not rude. It doesn't demand its own way. Because, sometimes what we can do is we communicate our narrative. We think that's the only narrative there is, so you better come to my narrative. So we look at it from that perspective, and there's not a balance there. So not demanding its own way says, hey, maybe my narrative isn't accurate. And so let's begin to talk about our narratives together. So like I said, if we look at this passage and we applied it to how we handle conflict, man, it's a game changer. It's a game changer. So here's what I want to encourage you to do today. Is I want you to take this passage and I want you to go home and I want you to think about, how do you navigate conflict? And just am I patient? Am I kind? Am I not jealous? Like, walk through it. And if there's something that stands out, like, oh, I cannot be patient at times, let me begin to work on that. Or I can come out, I can be rude. I don't mean to sound rude, but my tone sometimes comes out rude. I can begin to look at that, or I can be bossy. So take this and look at it and examine, according to the Scripture, how do I handle conflict? How do I communicate it? How do I talk about it? And then begin to look at how can you start to change it. How do you start to change it? And this is important too, as you're telling your narrative and they're telling their narrative, begin to just be aware, like, is this going sideways in the way that we're handling this? Because if so, then maybe what we need to do is reel it back in so we can get to a place where it's safe to continue this conversation.